Here we go. So we're live here with Kristen. She's somebody I really value because I don't read everybody's stuff, but I read her stuff and I find it really interesting and well written, and I learn something every time I read it. So I am so happy to have you back again to talk about some of the stuff that we can talk about. And I indicated in the title it was a potpourri and we talked about this a minute ago, because I figured there'd be a bunch of subjects that we'd talk about, and I threw out some to you. And then since I threw them out, there's been a whole litany of things. So again, great to have you here. And anything you want to say before we jump into it?
Well, it is great to see you again, and it's a high compliment. Thank you for that. And I just want to compliment your background.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah, that just for everybody. So I'm in the Alps today in honor of Alpine. So that's the connection. And
hey, I have a joke for you before we start.
Oh, go for it. Go for it.
I'm not a good joke teller, but
you're fine.
I couldn't come on here without.
You're fine.
This is in honor of the counterfeit crooks.
Okay.
What lies at the bottom of the ocean and shakes?
I don't know.
A nervous wreck.
A nervous wreck. Very good. Very good. I have two journalist jokes and one of my favorite legal jokes.
Okay.
The legal joke is better than the journalist jokes, to be honest, but whatever. A journalist asked a programmer what makes codes bad. He answered, no comment. All right. It's difficult to find. Yeah, it's difficult to find journalists qualified to report on rhythm sections. They need to cover all bases and can't miss a beat.
Dun-dun-dun.
All right. Now, this is one of my favorite legal jokes, and because I don't take offense at it, but as the lawyer awoke from surgery, he turned to the nurse and asked, "Why are the blinds shut?" The nurse said, "There's a giant fire with flames across the street, and we didn't want you to think that you had died."
That's good.
Okay.
That's good.
All right. That one I like. So kind of like what we're going to talk about, and wherever it goes, that's fine.
Right.
But we're going to talk about commercial real estate.
Okay.
We're going to talk about GTII and MMTLP and finger motion, DJT and Devin Nunes, Trump, I guess indirectly that way.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about the protests that are going on, which we mentioned. We're going to talk about Ken Griffin, and we're going to talk about the FTC's non-compete provision, which came out that nobody's talked about. That's what you're supposed to say. And we're going to talk about something you just posted, and I want to we're going to start with that.
Okay.
You referenced, I think today, maybe, the non-disclosure. Somebody was fined, TD Ameritrade, I think, tried to prepay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
the anti-money laundering
fine. Yeah. So there's a statute required after 9/11. There was a statute that required certain transactions to be reported so that the government could track money laundering, because money laundering was purportedly the way that terrorists could be financed. So so that's been around for a while. So tell us about what happened with TD Ameritrade.
So they put aside money because they think that they're going to face a fine because they didn't have proper anti-money laundering procedures in place. But it's a hefty amount. I think it was it? I can't remember. I'm trying to look up the number as we're talking.
It was the fine was going to be, they estimated like 450 million.
That's what I thought it was. Yeah.
And they're putting up like 150 or something.
Yeah. I mean, and then there was another one, and I forget what bank it was. It was like 1.3 billion that they just had earnings, but they forgot to kind of mention that this was part of it. I mean, these are huge numbers we're talking about.
Right. And if you were cynical, you would think maybe they don't want somebody to look into this, and that's why they're offering the money. Here you go, and we can move on.
But just go away.
Yeah,
we'll just
I don't know.
That thing that says we don't admit to anything and move on.
Yeah, and the reason why Alpine is in the picture here is because Alpine, one of the great acts they did is they had, I think, on the order of 2,000 or 3,000 violations of the same Bank Secrecy Act. They were fined, I think, $12 million. But there's no way to know if anybody ever collected that money. And, just if they had collected that fine, that might have been enough to kind of end that story. And
it's interesting. I mean, we talk about these fines. You also talk about the amount of tax that isn't collected. So it's saying like, oh, when you look at our national debt, it should be alarming to everyone because we have, just every administration just overspends and they don't know how to manage a budget. But there's money out there to collect if they actually settled trades and fine people proper amounts, right? Not just the cost of doing business fines, but
or put them in jail, or put them in jail, right?
Well, that too, yeah.
Yeah, and we know, I don't remember which country, it might have been China. There was I think she was the first woman to be sentenced to death. I think she was a developer, and
she was in charge, I believe, if I'm remembering the story, in charge of a bank, like the finances for a long time. And then the people who were working with her, they got sentenced to life. I think there were 2 or 3 executives who worked alongside her, but she was, that was a pretty powerful picture. She was,
I was amazed. I was thinking
around her, and she was there, and she looked like somebody you'd see on, in the grocery store.
Right. And if it was like, you can imagine like Silicon Valley Bank, right? Though, if that was the repercussions, there probably wouldn't be many defaults after that. There probably wouldn't be a lot of misconduct. But I'm not saying that the system, I'm not supporting the system, but there's probably a middle ground between having basically a slap on the wrist and chopping somebody's head off. There's probably a middle ground, and it's right. And I think if you send somebody to prison, that's a pretty sharp penalty, and that would make a point. Yeah, that makes a point. Yeah,
we don't need to use China as our guide for disciplinary, action.
Yes, I agree. Just like we don't have to use Saudi Arabia in terms of like thefts, right? But it just kind of shows you the contrast, and obviously there is another way of kind of punishing people and getting a better effect. It doesn't seem like they really have an interest in stopping the conduct. That's the only thing you could draw from that. And I was interested by TD Ameritrade really being upfront about it and trying to get a head start.
Get ahead of it, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Well, and you see, like Goldman, I think they just try to get rid of some of their credit card debt. There's just things that are happening because they're running out of cash. The discount window, the whole thing. Once they shut down that emergency bank program, that really threw the banks for a loop. But you're still not, it's starting to churn, but it may take a while till we see all of it.
One of the articles you wrote made me think about something. We heard about Mark Basile. He went into New York. He filed some petitions to try to get pre-discovery. And just recently in Texas, I'm sure you're aware of that, Nextbridge went after TradeStation, in essence, for it's a similar, I'm not a New York, by the way, not legal advice, of course. I'm certainly not a Texas lawyer or a New York lawyer. So take it for whatever it's worth, along with whatever else I say. Just take it for whatever it's worth.
I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah, just play one on TV. But it was basically a very similar statute there, but there they could take a deposition and find out information. We'll see if it's allowed. It's been allowed, I think, because I read a little bit about it yesterday. There have been like 5 counties in Texas that have permitted it under certain circumstances. Not this particular kind of circumstance, but it's certainly worth a shot. And if it's granted, then hey, we're off to the races. But what I was thinking,
in any of these cases, right? Because WNBO, NWBO, that's the brain cancer treatment. They're close to getting discovery. Now, whether it happens or not remains to be seen, but you can tell the market makers, because there's a number of them that are being sued either directly or indirectly. They're nervous because if discovery happens, what are they going to do? They've already said the evidence that they're supposed to hand over, the emails and stuff, they haven't done any of it yet. They're still fighting it. But if they get that, that's huge.
Yeah, then the case is very settleable at that point in time. At least their interest to be settlement. But I was thinking about, you referenced Goldman Sachs, and I think Ham referenced Goldman Sachs too at some point in time. So they get fined, let's say, $1 billion for activities 5 years ago, 4 years ago, 3 years ago. No disclosure of the names. And then I was thinking, we have these statutes, and again, not a New York lawyer, not a Texas lawyer, but, I was thinking, could you use that pre-petition statute to go after Goldman to disclose the actual securities? So if you knew you were a plaintiff or not, because otherwise, how do you know if you've been harmed by Goldman if you don't know what they sold or shorted or when? Because you have no idea.
Right,
So I
because
was
they send out those things and say they did a, whatever, 2 million trades, but they don't say that there were each of those trades, combined, it's billions of shares, and they don't say what company was manipulated.
None. And it wouldn't even have to be theoretically, it wouldn't have to be, you wouldn't have to buy from them if it was the same ticker that was impacted by their actions. So it would apply to people outside. But I wonder, and I'm just saying it out loud, and maybe somebody's tried this before and maybe it didn't work, or maybe it's silly, I don't know. But I was thinking, under those New York and Texas statutes, if you find a company and they don't disclose which securities, maybe you can go in, make this petition, get basically a pre-petition discovery to figure out if you qualify as a plaintiff, and to ascertain who are, if in fact Goldman, and we're using Goldman as an example,
right.
is a real defendant, because you really don't know personally.
Wouldn't they bury you in paperwork though, right?
They would. They would
just drag it on and on because they have so much.
Yeah, no question, but they don't. They would, but they don't like spending money too, and they like to have earnings. And at some point in time, maybe 10 years from now, it might take a long time, just like those environmental cases, that take forever, but they get to an end if they're, like Aaron Brockovich, right?
I was just thinking of Aaron Brockovich.
Yeah, right. Because the attorney for Aaron Brockovich is about 4 miles west of me, so really? It's very, very close to where I live.
In the Alps, there.
Yeah, so in the Alps, yes. She's up way up near the top, but that takes a long time, but you get an outcome. And so maybe, maybe it won't be an immediate relief, but maybe it's something else, another way to put pressure on, because we're looking for as many ways as we can put pressure on these guys.
Well, there was one that Ham and William were talking about the other day, George Donahue, who has sued Citadel because he did that a while ago. So, and that's still like working its way through. So that's another one. That's just like one individual who's really gone for it, which is great. I mean, you're right. You got to kind of hit him every which way because nothing seems to stick very well.
Yeah, obviously, I think I understood it, but I really didn't. Mm-hmm. Nothing here is easy.
Right.
It's like, everything is pulling teeth. Nobody's volunteering anything. You just have to extract it. And it's a strategy, right? Because it makes it difficult, wears people out, costs them money. It does. I mean, that's an effective strategy, but it's not a lot of fun. So any method by which we can add pressure, I think it's beneficial to us all.
Well, I think they also they want people to turn on each other, right? They also infiltrate these communities. So you think that the good guys are the good guys, and then you realize they slip up a little bit, and then you're like, oh, that's a shill. And they're obviously working for maybe a hedge fund, maybe not, but something. They're not working in your best interest, but they've convinced a lot of people that they are. So that's a problem. And then you have people who turn on, say, you or Ham or William or me, and it's like, what are you doing? Like, don't turn on us. Put the blame where it's supposed to go, which is trade settlement. Why aren't your politicians demanding it? Why aren't your regulators demanding it?
Yeah, I agree. I was going to ask you, because you were talking about Citadel. So what's your opinion about Ken Griffin and his recent response? Because we were going to talk about this anyway. His reply to Devin Nunes and his response to, I guess, accusations that Citadel could be shorting.
I wonder if he actually, I would assume he saw the press release or the answer before it went out because he's the head of the company. But it doesn't seem like that would be the response. Obviously, it's not the response I think he should have put out, because he's just making Devin Nunes angry. And now you've got this like political battle between a major donor and a politician, and then the company as well. But did he just react in the heat of the moment, if he did indeed know about it? Or did his press people put it out, and then have they been fired since then? Because that was just the dumbest thing. I mean, they should have just said, we'll look into it. That doesn't happen. We don't do that. And they didn't do that.
Or he is just feels so bulletproof.
Well, that's true.
That he thinks he could speak without any concern about the consequences. I know he may feel like he's immune, and maybe he has reason to. I don't.
Well, certainly to this point he has, right?
Yeah, he has been. Well, they've been fined. The same kind of thing. They've been fined, but whatever, cost of doing business. Mm-hmm. Kind of one thing we discussed is, Devin Nunes He's on retail side at this point in time, and we hope that remains, because the last thing I would want, and again, I take him at face value, so I'm not only a fan. I did send him an email. I said I'd be happy to help. I explained that I had some involvement in tickers that kind of like were relevant, and then I sent him a correspondence, same thing. Just so I reached out, did my duty, and I am hoping that he acts on behalf of all retail. My concern would be, not hearing about like a hearing, not hearing a lot of more discussion from him, and them having on the side resolve their issues privately, which, again, it wouldn't be a shock, but it would really be disappointing for retail if it happened that way.
A backroom deal is what I'm worried about too. Because here's the thing, they were in office before. He was the head of the House Intelligence Committee. This issue has been brought to probably every administration, Republican or Democrat. As I said, I'm politically homeless because at this point, I don't really trust any politician. So they knew about the problem. They didn't do anything. So to say they're going to do something now, yes, I hope they do. And he's saying the right things right now, but is it just until he gets the results in his stock, or is he doing a broad base for every manipulated stock? And I need to hear a little bit more.
I'll take the cynical approach that I'll accept this, even if he's solely doing it for political purposes.
Yeah.
That if that's it, and they don't really care, but they'll do it because it's going to be it's going to be beneficial. And by the way, that's why it was it miffed me that, and I'm in California, so you can imagine where I lie, but I was miffed at the lack of Democratic support for MMTLP. It didn't make any sense to me, especially coming to an election year. I would think that's a slam dunk issue. Support retail traders, and how are they not going to support you?
I didn't understand. I mean, last year, I'm talking like early 2023, get out in front of that as a politician. Force other people, force yourself on the Sunday morning talk shows, which have never discussed this issue ever. And they will eventually, probably, but they're going to wait until it's already snowballing. Why you would not get out and say, and then challenge your other politicians to do the same. And particularly like the bigger voices on either side of the aisle, like you could use it as your platform, and to not do it is ridiculously naive. I think I realize there's donors involved, and but you know what? You'd get those $5, $10 donations from retail, and I think you could still build your base.
Yeah, I just think it was a bad decision and just not thought out. Maybe they all weren't able to predict that the DJT part would play out that way also, where DJT became kind of a representative in a way for shorts now, and so they weren't able to predict that.
Yeah, I think it's just like, it's like with the debt. It's just like, we're going to just kick the can down the road forever. I mean, they've been doing this for decades, right? So, and then it just gets to the point where you have $1 trillion in interest. Like, what is that? You can't even fathom how bad that is. So
at some point in time,
and so we'll be out of office. Somebody else will deal with MMTLP. It's incredibly frustrating. And I'm not even in MMTLP, but you feel bad for the people who have been going to Congress, who have been walking the halls, who have been making the calls, and it's awful. And you shouldn't have to work that hard to get the truth. That's all you're asking for.
Yeah, Don, Matt, Anna, whoever else is there, have been walking the house, spending their time, and really, obviously, doing enough so that Tevin Nunes, when he submitted one of the letters was the MMTLP letter. So
that made me hopeful. That was good. I like that. Yeah,
that was good because, again, it maybe puts him in a position where it's hard now to kind of ignore MMTLP. And obviously, there's a ton of other tickers that have been manipulated like that. I know the AMC GME crowd, they bark about it. GTII, which is my favorite, of course, as we see by the picture, that's got a concentrated short position, but and Mullen and whatever, there's
so many. And that's the other thing. They want you to kind of pit stock against stock, right? You see we've been here it doesn't matter how long you've been here. It doesn't matter. Everybody's in the same fight. If somebody gets resolution, it's going to help everyone.
Yes.
So people are annoyed at the DJT because politically it doesn't align with them or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's about stock settlement. Like, keep the politics out of it. Don't go after each other. Focus where it should be, which is the politicians and the regulators, who are the only ones who are going to get you trade settlement.
Yeah, I know from the
Or the
MMTLP.
courts.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, or the courts. I know from the MMTLP crowd, that was very difficult. There was a lot of negative events that happened. So it's hard for them to, and I'm part of that. So it's hard for them to be number two. They don't want to be number two.
Right.
The fact that they were connected to DJT really was a really positive aspect, because they are considered as one. And again, that's why we started with hopefully Devin Nunes will remember that, and hopefully he will be effective. And I wish him success. Listen, if he could get legislation passed or an executive order, however, to outlaw shorting in the American exchanges, at least for a period of time, let's give it a shot. Let's try it for 6 months. We'll see after 6 months how it goes.
I mean, imagine running on that platform right now with everything falling apart. And then you say do a temporary ban of short selling, even if it's for a week. Can you imagine what would happen? Right? I mean, I'd like to see a 6-month ban like we've seen in South Korea, but you get what you'll take whatever at that point. But I think that would actually be a smart political platform for either party, whoever wants to take us up on and do it.
Yeah, listen, again, and I don't care if it's only for, I don't care. I don't care your reasoning, why you're doing it, whatever. You could have the worst reason.
Intentions.
I'll take it. We'll take it.
Yeah.
And again, I'm hoping, as MTLP crowd is hoping for some kind of hearing in Congress where this is brought out in the open, and where hopefully Mr. Gensler and Mr. Cook are made to pay for they suffer consequences for any misdeeds they may have undertaken or supervised.
But did you see, Patrick McHenry was calling for another hearing? I mean, he could have called for a hearing on MMTLP when people were begging him to do that, and he didn't do anything. So that's what I mean. It's the political opportunism and for their personal gain. It drives me crazy. Well,
it's also interesting because you learn about how the group functions. So in MMTLP group, there's a lot of concern if they spoke out against Congress people that they would suffer ramifications for that.
What have they gotten in the year and a half? Nothing.
Well, they've made progress because they've gotten to this point in time. Listen, I took a different tact, but I'm going to give them credit for that. But they were really concerned about what the ramifications were. And, I don't know if that was the right choice, the wrong choice, because, who knows, looking back, it would be interesting to see if a contrary technique was used. And maybe the next group of people in this position, after they form a community, and they don't get the results, maybe they take a different tact, and maybe they go on the anti-attack.
I think they did it right to start out. They did
definitely
they should have done. But if they want to get loud now because they haven't gotten results, and it's been since December of 2022, and they know that they knew about this long before then, right? If they want to get loud now and start going after politicians, particularly in an election year, I don't think that's a bad tactic at all.
Yeah, well, I don't think it is, but I have to give them credit for this far, because it really is a difficult task.
Yes, and they've done a great job. I mean, and they've, for the most part, aside from the people who are trying to tear them apart, they've stuck together. They've really been organized. I mean, they're really, it's incredible to watch, actually, and it shows they thought they were just going to go away, and they didn't. So bravo to them. And
it goes to show you that if you have to take on this kind of task, you really need thousands of hours, collectively, because without it, you're not going to get it done. And again, I think that's kind of a strategy by the other side. They know that it requires so much energy that most times that people won't be able to put it together, and they'll just kind of move off.
And that's why there's power in numbers, right? And that group has stayed together. I mean, they've had their differences or whatever, and there's such good DD on that.
Oh, amazing.
Among that group. I mean, when I think about it, I'm like, there are some really great, they should have been reporters, right? They're dig and dig, and they come up with just great stuff that will help attorneys too. If you have to take this to court and they're not going to get any resolution any other way. I mean, all this stuff is super, super smart. They've gone to the inner workings of how it all is, and it's fascinating.
Yeah, I find it interesting because a lot of them are smarter than me as I listen to them.
Me too.
And it's interesting the theories they come up with and the depth of their knowledge.
Yeah.
And it's been really it's helped me enormously. I'm one of them is if this ever happens, one of them is a witness in my arbitration.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we'll see. Since we're there, I might as well kind of like reference
let's
it.
go. Give us the update.
Yeah, so again, I'm displeased with the arbiters, so I filed something in there's a director of arbitration at Finra.
Okay.
And he has to rule, he or she, I don't even know if it's a he or she, honestly, but they have to rule on certain kinds of objections. So if I ask to remove the arbiter because he's biased or incompetent, he can rule on it, but it has to fit within certain guidelines. So there was one of those pending, and he didn't rule on it. So while that was going on, I elected and decided, this arbiter, there's 3 arbiters, one who's the lead arbiter.
All chosen by the company, I'm sure.
Yeah, all provided by some, algorithm through Finra. But he was the one deciding everything up through the trial being set now at the end of June.
Okay.
So if there was if I requested discovery and they said no, this person would hear it. And the way it worked is every time there was a proceeding or a request by me, 1, it was denied. 2, there was no hearing. 3, there was no rationale for the ruling. And 4, it didn't reflect any kind of review of the claims.
So here's the thing. This is why this is frustrating, because you're an attorney and you're going to push and push and push, right? Yes. But the average person goes up against this roadblock and there's nowhere to go.
Yeah, part of
or they don't know where to go. You know how to kind of work the system, but most people don't know, and they give up, which is what they want you to do.
Yeah.
Right? They pick the arbiter that they want, and that will help their company, that will, employ them again for some other case.
Right.
You're not even getting.
No, I'm a one-timer. That's it. What do you care about me?
Yeah.
No, I when I started, I had a dual mandate. My dual mandate was, 1, as I'm doing publicly, I would kind of bring it so people could see how it goes.
Yeah.
So we could understand, is it really a way that helps consumers get a remedy? And 2, of course, I want to win. That's of course, and I wanted to make new law. There were a bunch of reasons, but part was just to demonstrate how it was.
Well, I think most people hear the word arbitration, and unless they have gone through it, they don't even. It's just one of those things. I don't really understand the process because nobody really talks about it, right? And nobody shows how it works and how one-sided it really can be.
Well, there's also different kinds of arbitration. So I've done plenty of arbitrations.
Yeah.
And a lot of them, you'll have the ability to do discovery, and there will be rules it'll be loose. It'll be looser, but the rules of evidence, there are rules of evidence. So there is at least a general format, and you're able to prove up the case.
Right.
The way these guys set it up.
They're just cutting you off at the knees.
They say listen, if you don't have the case ready to go now, the day you file it, sorry. Right. And if you can't get access to the information because we're not going to let you, sorry. That's really how it's set up.
Yeah.
And if there's a claim that affords you, due process, I really don't think so. So as a result, because I'm paying for this, right? It's not just
I know. That's the other part. It's expensive.
Yeah, it's expensive. Yeah. But I'm saying I'm going through this experience and I'm paying for it. And this arbiter, I think, is terrible.
And probably cannot stand you. You're probably making lives miserable.
He's got to hate me. Yeah, they all got it. By this point, they all hate me. I've accepted that as one of the ramifications. So I've asked that he's been removed. So what I did is I filed a lawsuit in state court against him for declaratory relief. So I'm not asking, because I can't ask for anything from him because there's an arbitration. But what I did is I said, I'm not obligated to pay him whatever the fee that comes out in the end. I'm not obligated to pay that. And I'll show you why. I'll show you why I'm not obligated if we go through it.
Because you've gotten no help whatsoever.
Zero. So, so this at this point in time, now he's adverse to me directly.
Right.
I'm a plaintiff. He's a defendant.
Right.
So for him to be able now to conduct an arbitration
fairly
in that position would be really, that'd be questionable.
You don't
and
think
so, what was that?
You don't think he'd be impartial?
He may not be. But in the process, it turned out I looked at, I had to have him served. And we tried to serve him, and it turned out the address on his website, he doesn't have an office there.
Really?
So he doesn't have an office. So the office that's reflected on his website and on the state bar website is not correct, which is a problem, because that was probably the case when he was picked. So he didn't disclose that fact. Also, it indicated that although he's hovering over this litigation, that his experience today, how he references it, he's an estate planner. That's his expertise. Okay. And he sometimes employs litigators when needed. So to the extent, if he wants to make this argument, that he consults like a litigator, because this stuff, the litigator is not an arbiter. So he cannot consult somebody else outward. And he also has indicated he doesn't have the expertise. So this is new. So as a result, what I did is I sent in the day before we were supposed to have a hearing. I said, I'm not participating in any further hearings with this arbiter. Just basically cut it off. The director.
When was that?
How that was last week.
Okay.
Yeah, that like Friday, maybe Friday. Mm-hmm. The director responded. He denied the first motion that he had that was pending. Mm-hmm. He then said, let's brief the new one, and he postponed the hearing where I said I wasn't going to appear. And we shall see. We'll see where that goes. But I'm not going to let them, I'm certainly not going to let them push me around, and I'm not going to tolerate being, it's kind of like, I think I said it on a video. Have you ever seen the movie Animal House?
Yeah.
Kevin Bacon was in that.
Was he in that?
Yeah, he was.
Yeah, I guess he was.
A young Kevin Bacon is at the other fraternity house.
Yeah.
And at one point in time, they're swatting him. Mm-hmm. And he says, thank you, sir. Can I have another? So I thought of that as I'm literally, the arbiter is just kind of like running through the paces, collecting a fee, and completely inappropriate. So now everybody knows it's public, and to the extent that you participate, you kind of are on notice of that. Now, what was kind of like shifting that a little bit, somebody asked me about GTII and the dividend, because there's a dividend that was put out by GTII. And I know we're bouncing all over the place.
Like a year ago. Wait, before we go to GTII though, so you filed this suit against him. What's the next steps in that? I mean, he should remove himself, right? From your arbitration.
He should, but I don't know if he will.
Okay. And then you still pursue this in court. So you've got two things going on.
Yes.
You've got the arbitration and then the lawsuit. Okay.
Yeah. And again, I would prefer not to be chasing this guy down. I have no interest in doing that. But again, it is what it is. And it really is, it's obviously ridiculous the way the process is being conducted. And it's obviously at some point in time, as you so brightly chose and decided, at some point in time, if you call somebody incompetent, they may get a little annoyed, right? A little bit.
Yeah.
And, you have to be a remarkable human being not to be impacted by that and remain unbiased. And I think, to be honest, this 81-year-old gentleman who doesn't appear to be fully, I don't think he's working full time. So that means like the arbitration becomes even more important to his lifestyle and income and his connection to the clients that supply him income. Like, again, like you said, you figured that out, but Fidelity might give him 20 cases, right? Mm-hmm. Hoffman's going to give him one, and Finra is going to give him a lot of cases. So for example, if I ask for the depositions of Finra personnel, as I did, he might not be inclined to grant that because he's got a financial conflict of interest. And again, that's how the system is set up. A complete.
It's just so stacked against the retail investor, right? Who's just trying to find out information. It's just not good at all.
Yeah. So we're going to keep on plugging away on the MMTLP arbitration, and we'll kind of see how the process works out. And again, I hope that Devin Nunes is successful with whatever he does. I know that's going to benefit kind of what we talked about. If you let one go, that should make a lot of them go.
And you know what, too? He's using the words, I know Ham has like prepped them all and whatever, but counterfeit shares.
Right.
That's the first time I've heard counterfeit shares being used in an interview on national television. Like, that's good, right? Those things were over the target. That's what Ham says. So, I mean, you hear his words coming out of Devin Nunes' mouth, which is fine. But at least it's explaining it to people in ways that they can understand. And at least the national media is finally paying attention. Whether it serves their political interests or not, doesn't matter. Right. Just any attention is good attention on this issue.
And it is, and you're right, it is difficult, when you're explaining, like, I've heard MMTLP, a million times, and I kind of understand it generally. But, if you hear it once or twice, your head's going to spin,
Plus, that's such a complicated case because it went through so many iterations.
Right.
So if that's the first case you're trying to explain to somebody, their head's going to spin.
Yeah. The bottom line is that the shareholders got screwed. That's the bottom line. And that needs to be rectified. So I was going to talk GTI, but let's go back to it was like the main topic we were going to talk about when we started. So we were going to talk about commercial property and banks and foreclosures. So why don't you kind of like go for it?
So, I mean, the first, I've noticed like commercial property, like last year, there was a paper that was written about commercial property loans that it was an issue. Nobody really paid attention. Then China, they had all the Evergrande, which has been going on for a while, and then they went into liquidation. And then there were other developers in China, Country Garden being one. There's one, I think it's Kasi or KASIA, I think it is. They're all these developers who are in trouble because they just are over leveraged. So people were like, oh my gosh, look at what's happening in China. And I'm like, look at what's happening here. Like, we don't need to we definitely should look at China, but we should also look at what's happening here. And because it wasn't happening immediately here, they were able to cover it. Now you're starting to see, I mean, I post it all the time, just, this $600 million loans defaulted on, the building goes for like pennies on the dollar that they paid. And it's happening in many, many big cities. And the media is saying, oh, well, it's office space. And they're not talking about the fact that these banks are over leveraged and they're now defaulting on loans, and these developers are defaulting on loans. There was the tallest building in Brooklyn, and that's a big developer, and that loan got defaulted on. So you're seeing it in San Francisco, you're seeing it in Chicago, you're seeing all these different big cities, and only now is it starting to get some attention. It's certainly not enough attention, but we're talking big, big money. And, we were talking earlier, and I said, at some point, you're going to be able to get a 30-story apartment building for cheaper than you can for a house. So it's crazy.
Yeah, I saw it, and I was hoping it wasn't it.
Yeah.
Because I saw it, I think it was I don't remember, it was the 70s or 80s. I was like 4 years old at the time. 70s or 80s, the Japanese were heavily into real estate, especially on the West Coast. Made sense because that's the shorter flight transportation. And all of a sudden, the Japanese economy hit the skids, and the Japanese pulled out of the West Coast, literally. And the office market tumbled and real estate tumbled. And then across the street from Crypto Arena, which used to be Staples, which is downtown LA, there was a 3-building project that was built by Greenleaf. Greenleaf was a Chinese developer. In 2019, they said, because China passed a new law where they prohibited, I think, developers from taking more than something like, and I'm making up numbers, but let's say developers couldn't take more than $10 billion outside of China because they wanted to keep the capital in China. And so Greenleaf had a bunch of projects in the United States, including one in San Francisco that's also at issue still, one in LA and elsewhere. I think one in New York, probably in Brooklyn, that redevelopment in Brooklyn that was going on. And so they basically shut down. So this is a 3-building, three high rises. I think the tallest one is like 65 stories that are residential and a hotel think it was like a Fairmont hotel, so a high-end hotel
Yeah.
with a bunch of commercial.
The Fairmonts have been having trouble all over Hawaii and
Oh,
I
okay.
think in different cities in New York too. Yeah, or in the US as well. Yeah.
So they'd spent $1 billion on it. That's where they were. They stopped. They couldn't complete it. So there's a shell that's completed from 2019. About 2 months ago, maybe a month ago, there were a bunch of taggers that tagged. It was a
I
big
saw
story,
this. I
right?
posted
They
the story.
tagged the entire building. That's that building. And the problem is, because it's been sitting too long, you have to demo what's there. And so this $1 billion spent, it would cost $2 billion to complete the project. So when you were talking about that, somebody get something cheap, somebody would get that for zero,
right,
to take it over and to complete it. And there was another office building, an elderly office building that was recently sold in downtown LA. I knew San Francisco is the same thing. I think this is going to be repeated over and over again.
It's kind of in every city. Once you start looking, you can find it in so many places.
Yeah. So, I mean, values in commercial property, it makes sense if you don't have tenants, right? Post-COVID, people stay home. You don't have tenants, no tenants.
And the thing was, say these are 10-year loans, right? Or whatever, or 3-year loans or whatever they're now maturing.
Right.
And the interest rates, look at the interest rates. So it's going to cost them so much more. They don't have the money and they don't have people in the buildings.
Right.
So,
their only solution is to walk, right?
Yeah.
And the interesting part, and again, I've had some experience with that because I was involved in the savings and loan litigation way back.
Yeah.
And I've done a lot of foreclosures on the good side of the foreclosures, by the way. And when it comes to commercial property, lenders will do everything in their power to avoid a foreclosure. Whereas in residential, they don't want it because there's administrative costs, whatever, but they'll do it. But in commercial, for years, literally, they'll work on a project for years to do some kind of workout because they don't want it. Now, because of the circumstances, they have non-performing assets. They're not getting paid on these assets, and the values are cut in half.
Yeah.
So, at some point in time, they have to recognize that loss. And you can imagine the consequences on their financial statements. And this is going to be with a lot of institutions across the entire country. And I presume if it's in the United States, it's probably elsewhere too. You were talking about the Chinese developers.
Germany, same thing.
Germany's
big problems. I mean, Europe, just in general, you're seeing it all over.
Yeah, and it makes sense also because banks they do things elsewhere. So an American bank might do something in Europe, and a European bank might do something in the United States. And it hasn't hit. And maybe, I've hoped for many years, by the way, because I know that it's obviously there's nobody to pick up the space.
Right.
I'm in, just to kind of give you like a personal view, I'm in an office park. So there's 3 buildings. Before COVID, there were about 500 ground spaces, and there were not enough spaces for everybody. So you had to park elsewhere. Post-COVID, the most number of cars I've seen is 20. And this has been, I don't know, 4 years. There are owners of these buildings.
Right.
Somehow they're still here. I don't know how, but they're still here. But they have an asset that's worth substantially less. And at some point in time, there has to be an impact or some new way of repurposing commercial property. So now you can put new tenants in there and you can have income and kind of restore the value.
But converting all those buildings, that also costs money, right? It takes time to do that. So there's no quick fix. And with all these loans coming up, many this year and in the subsequent years too, it's going to be a problem that is just going to, I think it's like a domino effect. And we're just starting to sort of feel it. The emergency bank lending program ended in March. Now you're starting to see, it's going to be a ripple effect. That's why they're saying, look at what people said when the bank in Philly went, they seized it or sold it on Friday. Of course, they announced it late Friday, which is what you do when you don't want people to hear the news. It's the Friday night news dump. But people that still is making news on Monday and Tuesday.
Right.
Imagine if that's 10 or 15 or 100 banks. And what is going to be the reaction? And the warning signs have been there. The media is not covering it. And people are kind of going about their lives, and then they're going to be shocked, and then they're going to panic. And that's the problem with everything. And that's what they're, you know, when I see the job numbers, like, I'm just like, okay. And then you wait for the revision, and they're not the same. So it's like, what do you believe and what don't you believe? And I'm always skeptical about everything anyway, but you have to kind of look at everything with a skeptical eye, because
that's probably more realistic.
Yeah.
I don't think you can paint a rosy picture. I guess, you know, I think it's analogous, kind of as you were talking, I was thinking about it. You know, part of the problem with the last housing crash, where everybody got, you know, a lot of people lost their homes, was because they had variable mortgages and they kind of went up. And so they reset, and there was a problem because they couldn't afford the reset. People got in trouble. So even though this really isn't like a reset, in effect it is, because you have to refinance. You don't have a higher rate. At a higher rate. So if you keep your property, you probably can't afford the payment.
Right. And if you're talking about commercial real estate, now you're talking like hundreds of millions of dollars in these big buildings. So the refinance, like the amount is just enormous, because it's big for one house. So
and who's gonna put up the money?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, because, you know, typically, you know, for big institutional loans, it's going to be like an insurance company, a pension fund, whatever. You know, if commercial real estate's in the toilet, some of these entities aren't able to put their money in just by, you know, bylaws or other restrictions. So I don't know if the money is available. Now, of course, the Fed could print money, but what's the result of that? Right? We get super inflation out of that, right? They just kind of like go back to the printing press. We know how, and, you know, everybody can feel inflation, right? Over the past 3 years, you know, you go to the store, that's kind of also kind of what you were saying. Everybody says, you know, jobs are okay, whatever. If you didn't know anything, if you didn't know any numbers, and you just kind of went by feel, you would say the economy is kind of struggling. That would be a feel. Maybe maybe a consumer might have a lot of money. Somebody could have a lot of money and not be impacted. But if you just had, coming from a feel standpoint, there's a lot of stuff. And then you see the numbers, and it's in conflict a lot. But as you indicate, a lot of times governmental numbers are adjusted, and maybe adjusted more than once.
And quietly, they're adjusted when no one else is looking. And essentially what you have is, like, you have the middle class eroding, right? Like, the gap is becoming much bigger because you're eroding the middle class. And, you know, when they were paying people, when they were doing the printing press, they were helping themselves first. You know, let's be clear. And then people got whatever the checks they got, if they got a check. It was like $1,200. But then I heard, I think it was Ken Griffin who was saying, like, well, you know, then they reinvested that. And I'm like, do you think they're really drawing down on that $1,200 that you gave them a couple of years ago?
Yeah, like $1,200, that's lasted for 3 years.
Like it makes no sense. But if you put the narrative out there, which I feel like a lot of this is a narrative, then I guess they hope you believe it at some point. But
I think it's a real, I agree with you. I think it's a real problem. And obviously it goes with the banks. So real estate is a problem, and the banks are a problem. Those are two distinct problems. They're, you know, correlated, but those are two distinct problems. And
if you watch the discount window too, and you see how that's drawing down, like, that's scary too. So, I mean, there's so many different signs. And then if you look at, I've been watching Japan for a while, and obviously now people are paying attention to the yen, but like even, you know, weeks or months ago, there's something there. And I think SoftBank, what if SoftBank goes, right? Because they're tied to that. Then is it like Credit Suisse with Archegos or whatever, you know, like,
contagion.
These are all big events, and they could be those black swan events that you really worry about.
Yeah, we don't. And, you know, and are we comfortable that the feds are capable of supervising and managing? You know, that was the first thing that occurred to me, is when Silicon Valley Bank went down, and they're like 5 miles away from the regulators who could just visit. And I think they even have a rule that was approved again, where certain circumstances, if they want to inspect a bank, they can do it from their office. They can stay in their office, inspect, which I think is not a great inspection in my my opinion, whatever. But I mean, after that, after, there's other ones. Are we comfortable that these people who have done such a fine job regulating the securities markets too are
Right.
gonna regulate the banking system? And I'm not particularly comfortable in that.
Well, I mean, we were talking about transitory inflation, right, a couple years ago, which was a joke, but whatever. They were saying that it was transitory. And then you're talking about 6 rate hikes, I think it was, right? 5 or 6
Yeah.
in December, November. And I'd be surprised if we get one this year.
Yeah, I think one is, I don't know what because they haven't put out their board.
They're hinting toward November, but it keeps getting pushed back, right? It was
Yes.
June, then it was July, then it was.
Yeah, I have to give Ace credit. I thought he was nuts when he said it, but he said it when he was like 6 or 7 cuts. He said
No
0.
Yeah.
And
yeah. I mean, how can you? Because here's the thing: you have banks that are over.
By the way, good job, Ace.
Yeah, good job. You have banks that are over leveraged. So now you're going to lower the rate so that they can borrow more when they're already over. That makes no sense.
Yeah.
I mean, you're just giving them sort of another playground to play in, and you can't. They're already over leveraged. It would not make sense to do that. But in the meantime, it's going to hurt everybody out there who's trying to fill their shopping cart.
Yeah, and including everybody in the securities business, right? Right. So like if there's a crash, and we're not predicting a crash because who knows when. We're just saying if you look at circumstances, there's enough reason to be concerned about certain facts. And if there was a major bank failure, the stock market's going to take a huge hit.
Yeah.
And if there's a crash in commercial real estate where it's now not just what we're seeing, but there's an impact down the road, it's going to impact the stock market too. There's no way around it. And it won't just impact the stock market in the United States, it'll impact the world stock market. That's just kind of
with SoftBank, which I was talking about. If you look at one of their statements, they were talking about they would use collateral, like if something happened from ARM. But like, what if ARM goes down? You don't know. So, it's also interconnected, and one thing can just be it's like Jenga, right? If you pull one thing out, you could have real big problems. And it doesn't help that the press isn't talking about this, because I think 2008 came and a lot of people were surprised if they weren't paying attention.
Yeah.
If they weren't listening, because if they didn't understand subprime mortgages or whatever, they just went about their daily business. They were shocked. And you don't want that to happen again. You don't want people to be caught flat-footed, because it really will impact everyone.
Yeah, transparency at least gives people an opportunity to prepare for the outcome. It's not like they're not going to be happy about it, but at least they can prepare for it. When you're caught blindsided, there's nothing you could do, and it really pisses people off, really.
Right.
More so because you're kind of owed that, and you presume if something happens, somebody knew. Somebody knew something. We're talking about it, so if it happens, we're not the only ones who are talking about it. So I agree that unfortunately, with like a lot of things, the United States is more reactive than proactive. And
I watch the Sunday news shows every week. I've been doing it for years, obviously, from my job. But I watch every channel. I take them all, and then I watch, and not one of them has covered a lot of this. It's just they find other things to talk about. I'm like, this should be, I think, in the A block, which is the top block, and it's just not.
Yeah, maybe politically inspired. Who knows? Because most of what we get in some way is politically inspired from some source. That's the way I kind of view everything.
Yeah, you have to know. I think you have to read from. Everyone's like, well, I just read this. I'm like, well, I think you should read them all and just know what political viewpoint they're coming from, and then somewhere in the middle is the truth somewhere. So
I try to look at the writers.
Right.
And I try to kind of see what their backgrounds are. So whatever their biases are, and listen, it's okay. It's not, I'm not complaining about having a bias. That's human nature. You have some perspective, but don't hide it to the extent it influences your opinion. Be upfront about it. That's okay. That's okay. It's unfortunately not everyone is as transparent about their interests.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And we don't know, and we don't know also, you were talking about the Shills way back.
Yeah.
And we don't know who compensates those people. And when you mention it, my view on the Shills, and I agree with you. If you look at a room, it out of 500 people, you got to figure at least 1 or 2 are Shills. And if those naysayers are not being paid, then those are the most disgusting people on earth, because they get pleasure out of the despair of other people.
Yeah.
If that's the alternative, if they're not like Shills and they
Right.
just like want to make fun and
It's
tug
awful.
on the downside of, you know, if people have lost money, that's
Yeah.
really a pathetic human being.
Yeah.
Really. That's the way I look at it. Either you're getting paid and okay,
And
that's pathetic.
that's gross too, I
Pathetic
think,
too.
right? I think that's terrible
pathetic
too.
too. But
Yeah.
it's at least it's not like I don't know, if someone is that just black spirited, that's kind of the way I would see it.
Yeah.
It really rubs me the wrong way, that as opposed to somebody who's being compensated, at least I understand the motivation.
See, I don't though. I
Okay.
don't, because I feel like you shouldn't be helping spread this disinformation and this. They know better, right? Like,
oh, there's no question.
And-
I don't. Yeah, I agree. I wouldn't do it, but at least I understand money causes people to do a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean,
So
we've seen what greed does,
understand
right, with the stock market. So
I understand the motivation when somebody's being, you know, corrupted that way. I don't understand the motivation when there's nothing, and you're just kind of that person.
Yeah, it is amazing how many people can be bought and sold.
Yeah, it is. Just yeah, unfortunately.
It's really disheartening, honestly. So.
I'm going to talk a bunch about GTII, but before we get to that, I wanted to talk about, and we kind of talked about a little about this today, since it's in the news. And I was thinking, you were at New York 1 at one point in time. I was thinking you would probably be covering Columbia last night.
We were just talking about that, my former colleagues and I. Yeah, they're like, and I mean, you'd be doing breaking news for hours and hours, but it's different now, I feel like, because, you know, do you really watch local news anymore? I don't know. Like, it's changed, right? So, because you can get so much information on YouTube and Twitter and everywhere else, if you know where to look and who to rely on for the truth.
Yeah, I was trying to watch local news last night because so I watched Columbia. So there were protests. There's I don't know, however you want to frame the there's protests involving the war in Gaza. At least that's how it's framed. So there's a pro side and the anti side. The pro side is larger, and being from so I've been open about that. I'm Jewish. My parents were Holocaust survivors. So generally numbers are always, the Jews are usually in the smaller numbers because there's a small number of Jews in the world. There's approximately, I mean, people estimate at maximum there's 20 million Jews in the world, and probably half in Israel and half elsewhere, probably most in the United States. So it's okay. I'm not disturbed by the fact that when I lose a battle because numbers are off. And so it's okay, you know, that the demonstrations happen. It's not okay, though, when people are intimidated by the demonstrations. And it's not okay when they're being infiltrated by either anarchists or pro, whatever you want to call them, because they just stimulate despair, really. And I'm sure most of the students that are involved, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt that they're well-intentioned, but they're subject to being manipulated like everybody. So I'm not putting that.
Yeah, I mean, Hamas has a very big PR branch, right? So they know how to tell their story. And if they're on TikTok, which is where many, many college kids are, I think they have to be aware that they're being fed a narrative. Hamas is a terrorist organization, right? So, and you know, how much history do people know? I don't know. And so I think all of that has to come out. And then you see, like, I think on one campus, half of those who were arrested were not affiliated at all with the university, which is a concern, right? Because who is either bringing them in there, paying them, whatever? There's a lot of questions there. So I just read an account too at another college campus, and they were fighting to take down the Hezbollah flag and put up the US flag. And I'm like, you know, this is the United States, and these are the conversations that are happening. And do people really understand all that's happening? Like, yes, people are upset because of what is happening to the people who are caught in the middle in Gaza. I get that, of course. But there's so much history and all that.
I was going to say, so I find it, for me, obviously, it's a really difficult and confusing issue.
Yeah.
So, and I'm as appalled as anyone else what's going on in Gaza. I am. Who wouldn't be appalled? Who would? What human being?
Living,
what human being would not be appalled by that?
Right. Of course.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is, I guess people don't understand that Jews are not one. They're not one entity. So that I'm not speaking on behalf of all Jews.
Right.
And my sister happens to be Israeli, as it turns out,
Hmm.
and she lives in Israel. Now, she lives kind of in the Tel Aviv, the way Israel is set up, the kind of the coastal section, like Tel Aviv, happens to be very westernized and not particularly religious. And like Jerusalem and more the interior of the country tends to be more religious. And the politics are quite different in those areas. And in Israel, there's like 20 parties. It's not like the United States.
Right.
So there's quite a vehement disagreement amongst parties. And before, this is the irony of all ironies. So before October 7th, which is the date of Hamas's attack into Israel, there were huge protests against the government of Israel because people like my sister do not like the existing government. And what happened as a result of the Hamas attack is it reunited everybody in the country to be behind the government. And so, and a lot of the people who are against the state of Israel don't like the government. But what they did is really kind of reestablish the power of the government. Because I think if time would have played out, I think Netanyahu would have lost an election. They would have called because they were trying to call for new elections.
There was just recently a huge protest against him again. I saw it like last
week.
There
are protests, but before that, every Sunday they were going out there, including because I would get pictures from the protests because my family would send them to me. They were huge, and that was the first time ever in Israel that there had been political protests like that. So what happened was it galvanized the country, kind of like what happened after 9/11. Even if you didn't like Bush, right? Even if you hated Bush for a while, you were on his team for a while at least.
The country never felt so united, right?
Yeah, it does.
After that,
Yeah. So now you're trying to deal with a different group who have certain limitations because they feel at risk. Maybe their fears are not real, but it's part of the DNA that, to be honest, it arises out of the Holocaust. So when they're attacked, they feel like, they could cease to exist as a group. So they're very sensitive to that. And that's why we're in the position we are today. So in terms of the protesters, I really find it difficult, and to the extent that they're intimidating.
Free speech is fine, right? I mean, that's the country's built on. That's fine.
That's college.
When you're you're preventing Jewish students from attending class, or you're putting swastikas up on the, in the hallways and stuff. That is where,
well,
there has to be a stand, but you don't. So it's a tough one.
Yeah, it impacts everybody, not just the Jewish kids, it impacts everybody. And I know at Columbia, they're like getting ready for finals. So they have to deal with that. It might be difficult for them.
I think didn't they cancel the graduation at USC, right?
Yes, they did.
They did because they were worried.
But they kind of messed, this is my opinion,
agree.
They kind of mishandled that whole thing.
They mishandled it,
So I understand why the students are, but they feel like they have the right. And it's interesting because they compare it to 1968. So I was a 10-year-old, a 9-year-old, whatever. That's the Vietnam War. So the comparison, I don't think, is an apt comparison. So, because that involved Americans losing their lives in another country. I understand, by the way, I understand the despair, and war is terrible, and we don't want innocents to get killed. We certainly don't want civilians to get killed, whatever. I understand. But it's not the same thing. And I'm hoping that to the extent that the protests continue, that they'll be able to manage in a way that doesn't intimidate or is not designed to intimidate other people. And if they want to say whatever they want, that's wonderful. Whatever you want to say, just do it in a way that doesn't impact and limit other people.
Well, it's also just not like we could have conversations between opposing sides, that would be more beneficial. And because you do find that. I mean, when they put two people who are so vehemently opposed, regardless of whatever the issue is, and they start to learn about each other and understand each other and hang out and all that stuff, and then they have real conversations. But when you're just kind of shouting at each other, which is what I feel like this country has done for many years now, is just like one side barks at the other side, nobody's listening, and everybody's just trying to bark louder than the other side, and it gets nowhere. It's like you're just spinning wheels.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I'm it's disturbing, and I hope it calms down. And anyway, wanted to talk about GTII. So one thing that happened is, and this is the first time that anybody knows. So somebody filed a whistleblower complaint against GTII and management. So I know that. What was that?
You weren't the one who did it?
I can't tell you who did it.
Okay.
That has to kind of remain confidential.
Okay.
But I know that it was done.
Okay.
So, and I know that I could tell you a little bit about it. I don't know if you followed GTII, but there's two aspects. So there's a dividend, and I started talking about a little bit about the dividend. So there was a dividend that was issued last year, I think April of 2023.
Yeah,
2023. And it was going to be, the total number of shares was going to be like 31 million, reflecting 10% of the total float, which I think was about 310 million. So it was issued and a bunch of things went down. And so people figured out that April 29th was the date. I can't tell you exactly or why that was a date.
Right.
And there was an opinion letter that was sent out by an attorney, because an opinion letter is required to get a restriction removed, one of the conditions. However, some of the brokers were still not, at least they were saying, there were some Canadian brokers that performed in the past, and apparently some other brokers performed in the past. Now maybe they're not going to perform, and I don't know if it's they don't have the shares or there's some other reason. But part of their
have the shares back in October, right?
Yes. Yeah. But their position is there was something that went on with regard to the structure or with regard to something that GTII did that gives them the ability not to remove the restriction. But they were kind of vague in it. So I started to kind of investigate that. And as it turns out, they were told to downlist April 10th of 2023. It was effective April 11th of 2023. It was for an ongoing problem involving some insider transactions or beneficial ownership. That is one of the issues that's now in the whistleblower complaint, by the way. So those are the dates. On April 23rd, they issued that special dividend. So it's 2 weeks after that.
Right.
But they didn't give notice of the downlisting until May 3rd. After the special dividend, maybe, cynically, you could say they were trying to hide it. And they were trying to use the dividend to kind of offset that other news. And they also didn't disclose the fact that it kind of prohibited them from getting into certain capital markets and what the underlying problem was, because it suggested that there had been an ongoing concern about this. It wasn't like the first time. This had been an ongoing concern. And I think it involves some kind of property. That's the ultimate issue. So it brings us to the current time frame, and now we have the dividend. So what Fidelity is saying, and it was acknowledged to a shareholder by one of the attorneys for GTII, inadvertently perhaps, they checked the wrong box. So
wait, who checked the wrong box?
Somebody from GTII.
Okay.
That was a suggestion. At some point, checked the wrong box. So it indicated they were a shell corporation.
Right.
If you indicate you're a shell corporation at any point, that tags you for the whole time. So even for like 1 quarter, you indicate, sorry, from now on, you're going to be treated as a shell company. The problem with a shell company is you need that opinion letter. That's why the opinion letter came from the attorney. And there's a case or a standard called Evergreen, which requires certain things now that you have to meet to get the restriction removed, or it allows somebody to raise the issue. And one of those is you've been transparent and disclosed the information to your investors. That's a general requirement.
Yeah.
In that disclosure, and in this 10K, it talks about this one downlisting. It doesn't say what they did. And based upon what I heard from Fidelity, kind of, and I didn't hear it firsthand,
Right.
that to me seems like that's the issue, that they will take the position there hasn't been full transparency. And if there hasn't been full transparency, we're not required to remove the restriction. Again, I haven't seen it, but that's what I'm feeling.
Okay.
That's what's going to happen.
I mean,
so
we can say even if there were full transparency, they still weren't going to.
Yeah, they probably
'Cause
weren't
they don't-
anyway. Yeah, but this was a reason. But they gave them a reason to. There was another error in the opinion letter. It had the wrong year, so it was supposed to say 2023, but it said 2022, and they literally just corrected that like 2 days ago because I brought it to their attention. That's how it went. So that's ongoing. So people who are having a difficult time getting dividend, that might be the reason they're having a difficult time getting a dividend. So what can you do about that? You could ask the broker. You could go into arbitration with the broker. We saw how that
that works so well.
Yeah, so well. The only other alternative that, and somebody might file a class action, and that might take years and whatever.
Right.
But it might be that you could do a class action in effect within the arbitration. So it's not a class action, but you could have 100 people file the same claim together just to determine that the shares should be issued or the restriction should be removed. I'm not suggesting that should be done, but that is a way where you wouldn't have to file like 100 different suits. And there's some ways they could get around it, but it's a way that perhaps people who are denied their shares could collectively come together and find out. Now, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, where are you with management now? Because
that was my next one.
Okay.
So I've had a long string with management. They have not responded to anything I have said since March 18th, I think. And I've given them.
They like you as much as the Fidelity.
Yeah, they do. They do. Unfortunately, another one who
good friends here.
Another one who loves me. And I've tried to be clear to give them an exit. Really, every time. They're just not willing to do that. And I've had some back channels of people that have had interaction with the CEO, and I don't think.
What is his reasoning for holding on?
I don't think he understands the consequences of. It's kind of like we were talking about when we started the fines.
Yeah.
So I spoke to an attorney in Las Vegas,
right,
who has had several cases against Reichman.
Okay.
That's the CEO.
Yeah.
And there were cases he was describing to me where there was a group of shareholders that had a dispute over with Reichman. He would refuse to pay them or to release the shares. They would have to sue him, and eventually he would capitulate. And it happened multiple times. So that is his reputation with this particular lawyer. And so I think it's just business as usual. And I think it's because it's a small company, he treats it as if it's his own. And he doesn't appreciate the fact it's a publicly reporting company. If you inside trade or manipulate the stock or whatever, that could be problematic. And as it turned out, I don't know where I saw it, but there was, since it's pretty close to me, a Ventura County man and the LA County man were charged in an alleged multi-million-dollar pump and dump securities fraud scheme. It was involving Airborne Wireless Network, and they somehow got control over the stock, and they would inflate the value and then sell it, and they wouldn't show that they were the owners. They also would use charities to kind of do underhanded things. Part of the allegation about GTII is in 2023, there were about 20 million shares that were gifted to charitable foundations when the company had zero revenue and had sky high expenses compared to 2022. So it was interesting to me when I saw that in the charitable part, and I was thinking about in terms, and I'm not suggesting anything, I'm just talking out loud and what occurred to me when I saw it. When that dividend was placed out, Whatever effect that had. I mean, if that was designed to pump the stock and they sold or distributed it.
Oh, right. Yeah,
and
at that time.
Yeah, or distributed a bunch of stock at that time, which I think they did. That could be problematic. And again, I don't think
that's something that you would go after, right? I mean, you've given them you've said get out of it, but if they don't, isn't that something you would look into?
Oh yeah. No, yeah. I sued him in California.
Yeah.
Whether I can get the relief I want in California, I don't know. But I've met with 2 attorneys in Nevada, and depending on how that whistleblower action goes, because maybe that will have some impact by itself. Right. But it may be the case that we try to get a group together, a group of GTII shareholders together to go after him in Nevada. We'd go after either some kind of proxy statement to get rid of the existing board, breach of fiduciary duty, or put a receiver in place to take over and running the business.
How long would that take, and how would that happen? Like, who would contact you if they were interested?
I'm going to put out a video, and I think I'll kind of invite people to contact me. They can DM me. Anybody can DM me. That's fine.
Yeah.
So I would whoever wanted to participate could reach out. We could
are they still able to sell shares now that you've filed?
Yeah, they have. Because they have a plan. Even though I warned them, I said, listen, you're on notice.
Yeah.
So it's a plan. So per the plan, they don't control the sale, but they can terminate the plan. So it may be the case they don't want to terminate the plan because that's an admission in some ways if they do it.
I know you can't say this, but do you feel like there are people, I know it's a very small company, but are there people within the company who may not want to be named or would like their name taken off this suit? And
there are, but the problem is, my understanding is that the CEO is covering the legal fees of those people. Because I agree. I think the people that are not the CEO and CEO and CFO is the same person, by the way. So the persons who are not that, if I were in their position, even if the CEO, and this is directed to this person, by the way, if you're listening, because they indicated they watched the videos too, by the way.
Okay.
But if they were, even if their fees were being paid, if the CEO got into real trouble, you're going down.
Yeah.
And I certainly, honestly, I don't want that. I was trying to communicate that in as non-threatening a way as I can, because I wanted them to understand that I saw, based upon what was going on, there were huge problems that they should be aware of. And, again, that doesn't deflect against Alpine, which is the background here. And I'm waiting for the decision in Alpine. I looked as of today. So there was the Court of Appeal finished the end of March 29th was the last brief they got. So it's been about a month. I expect.
How long do they usually take? A month to
30 to 60 days, I would say.
Yeah.
Okay. So it should be any time. This is the expedited expulsion in Washington.
That's not so expedited?
Yeah, not so expedited, and it will still be subject to appeal. Right. But I think if they lose, then it will be still impactful. I don't know if it's going to move the stock, but it will still suggest that Alpine eventually, and I think this is ultimately the truth, that Alpine eventually is going to go down. It's just a matter of when and how long.
Who is funding them? Do you have any idea?
Well, people think it's John Hurry.
Okay.
And
to do all these court cases, it's expensive.
Yes. Yeah. Apparently, I think I heard it somewhere. I don't remember where I heard it.
Yeah.
But yeah, they were spending like a boatload on legal fees.
Yeah.
Which suggests they have a boatload of money that they're protecting or other things they're protecting. And they were in the Cayman Islands. So they had operations offshore, and, who knows what kind of devices, that people use to move money and protect money. But, it's suspected that there's somebody funding it because they can delay things. And as they delay things, either they're making money directly on it, or they're moving money, or they're setting up an alternative business. But that's the only thing that really makes sense. But Alpine doesn't make the money to justify doing whatever it is. And, ultimately, the problem with Alpine is Finra and the SEC.
Right.
Because because they've had, this again is the star child for who should have been put out of business a long time ago, and why Finra and the SEC have not. This is exhibit 1 to show how incompetent they are, or corrupted, or both. I don't know.
And they can't now, because Alpine is going after Finra, they can't just shut Alpine down, right? They have to for this court ruling.
Yeah, they have to give them like full,
Yeah.
Even though they could have gone into federal court and done it, if they had done it, now they're kind of stuck that they have to give them full process, even more than we get in our silly arbitrations, substantially more, but they have to get full process, and then they have 2 appeals on top of that. And, again, once it gets to an appellate standpoint, it's probably over anyway.
Right.
They're not going to win, but they could keep the clock going, and whatever reason.
What's the longest they could keep the clock going on this?
If it worst case scenario, a couple years.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a worst case.
Yeah.
And I don't know if maybe if new management is in DC, I don't know. That might change. That might change things. But I don't know. I don't know if the next person goes in, if that ultimately changes how it's handled. But but notwithstanding that, still people are interested in GTII. So I have, my goal is not to kill GTII. I think I have to be transparent about what I find out, so people know, so they can make decisions based on that. Whether there's a short squeeze or not has nothing to do with what I just said. Because if it's going to squeeze, it's going to squeeze for other unrelated reasons. But to the extent that the management is looting the company by, giving away shares and selling shares, if 2 years passed, there wouldn't be a lot left over. Right. And whatever squeeze occurred would have been kind of ameliorated by the continuing dilution of the shares. So I know people are, kind of like what we talked about MMTLP. Sometimes the people are concerned about coming out and being forward and calling people out. But listen, if somebody's ripping you off, or at least the way I see it, it looks like they're ripping off. And the thing I asked, I said, the very last communication I had today, where I said, listen, just respond. If you respond and tell me, explain the issues in the 10K, that's all I want. And I've asked, multiple times.
Well, the thing is, you're saying people get upset if they start calling out people, but staying quiet has done nothing, but it's allowed this company to do exactly what they've been doing, which, now you're suing about. So staying quiet is not necessarily the best. I think you try it in the beginning. You assume that people are acting in good faith, but when you realize that they're not, then you have to go to a different tactic.
Yeah, and especially, in this case, if the management decides they're not going to respond to accusations, then that's not a denial, and that's not an explanation. So that's not sufficient. And now I think, if the SEC takes a peek, they might be, interested. And this again, the way I would think about it, Alpine. This is Alpine case, right? So you think the SEC and Finra are familiar with Alpine and what they're connected to, right? So if I were in something that was affiliated with that, I wouldn't want to be playing really risky stuff, because I'd be concerned that somebody might know all the players and whatever. So it made me
under the hood. Yeah.
Well, it made me take it to the next level. So I thought, is it just somebody being just difficult? Or are they hiding something? Is there something under the hood that they're concerned about that's going to cause them real problems? And that was my conclusion. That's the only thing that made sense to me. But I don't know. But I'm sure it's going to play out at this point.
Yeah. What's the next step with your suit? So you filed in March, and then
I'm filing an amended complaint, and but I'm really gonna. But I think to really get the relief that we want is we got to do it in Vegas.
Okay.
So I'm going to do my thing, but he's going to try to be evasive. He theoretically lives in Southern California. He lives supposedly at a hotel. But he shows his residential address is New York. but he doesn't. Apparently, if you met him in person, he'd tell you he lived in Southern California. So he's probably going to fight me on that. But the bottom line is in Nevada, since they're incorporated in Nevada, it could be a much more direct shot, and they couldn't avoid it. And there is, like I said, I spoke to a counsel that I think would be very familiar with the characters and would be able to
that could be helpful, right?
Yeah, we discussed it. By the way, we went beyond the discussion, but we talked about what the remedies would be and whatever anybody could do. I think we talked about enough stuff here. Is there anything else you want to say?
I don't think so. I mean, I think just people have to. I think people are doing good due diligence. They're keeping up the fight. I think that keeps the pressure on. Let's hope that Devin Nunes demands a congressional hearing and people actually listen, respond to him. And then, I mean, you'd like to see people who've been fighting for so long, particularly MMTLP, that community. And I mean, Finger is showing, did you see they put out they're on Instagram and Facebook now, Finger Motion.
I didn't see that.
Rang the bell. So there's big things. I think it feels like they're positive. You're not going to start an Instagram and a Facebook if you don't have something to tell, I think.
It looks like they have, I'm invested in Finger Motion also.
Me too.
It looks like they have a real business, and it looks like the business could be, could grow, not financial advice.
Right.
But it doesn't appear just to be a shell. Like GTII is different.
Right.
Maybe GTII could get an acquisition, or it could have a squeeze, but 20 years from now, I don't know if it'll be around.
Right.
But Finger Motion could have a long-term business and be very successful. So
when you listen to the CEO,
Martin Chen,
things that he puts out, or when William interviewed him, he's impressive.
Yeah, Martin Chen, I think he's very impressive. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know they're gonna, at least I saw a video from him. They're expanding outside of China too. So they service a lot of China, but they're expanding outside of China, kind of to diversify their risk too.
Right.
But yeah, no, I think Finger Motion is, and again, I like him because he's upfront and he appears to be aggressively trying to make something happen.
Right.
And
you can't say things are happening if they're not happening, because he would get in trouble. So because they are very conservative in terms of their press releases. Yeah. But if something is happening, you can disclose it too. You don't have to keep it. And if Finger Motion runs, or a lot of people thought that GTI might run afterwards, and that may be still the case, but who knows? Who knows?
But,
right.
Yeah, but in terms of how they end up, my view of GTI in terms of what it could do has not changed. Just I now know what has gotten us to this point, and it concerned me, obviously, and now everybody else knows. And again, the management could come out tomorrow, and if they could clarify all these points and explain it, and if they did it in a cogent manner, I would be pleased as punch.
Right. Or resign. They could resign.
They could resign. Yeah, I mean, I asked the board to resign. I guess the question would be, the only remaining question is, they diluted in 2022, the end of 2022, there was about 260 million shares. In the 2023, there were 370 million shares. So they diluted quite a bit. So that would have to be resolved in some fashion, which I'm sure it could be. Yeah. But stepping down, taking care of that certainly can be resolved. And again, there are a lot of suitors still interested in GTII because it has a name and because it has a concentrated short position. I've heard that many, many times. So, because otherwise, why would somebody be interested in GTI per se? Right?
If you have it in writing about the concentrated short position, right? That's in writing. So
yeah. Anyway, I wanted to thank you very much for your time, as usual. I'd love to do it again down the road. I'm sure things will change. Please follow Kristen, and if you have what would your contacts be?
K Shaughnessy too on Twitter.
Okay. Yeah.
Just make sure it's not the one with two N's or two, how they impersonate you and they put 3 S's. Just be careful. But
I do at KSHA, and it gets me.
Oh, and it gets you there. Okay.
Yeah, it gets me there. Yeah. Anyway, and I really enjoy what you're writing. And by the way, I was going to mention it. I like Frank Nez, because he talks about banking also, and Dennis Neal. I enjoy him also because he's pushing also. Just that they're out there listening. Anyway, Again, I wanted to thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
And thanks for all you're doing too, and keeping everybody up to date. And you're also, I think you're showing people how the process works. And, you know, if somebody wants to undertake it too, it's a process. They're going to have to really be able to put in the time, because you are. So
happy. If anybody wants to, you know, I'm happy to kind of guide them along to the extent I can. And I'm sure there are other attorneys out there willing to do the same thing. Anyway, I wanted to thank you again. Be well. Take care, everybody out there. Thanks for watching. And if you have questions, comments, please feel free to put them out there and we'll try to respond. Have a great evening.